Well, thank you. I've actually enjoyed this session a lot. It's great that this session devoted to this topic in particular as, there we go, good. As it's obviously something important for our patients, and as we'll see in this case, it may be important for our own reputations. This is an interesting talk to give. It's a battle between empiricism and emotions, and I'll sort of get into why that is. I'll break it down into the four fundamental questions that are presented with this topic. First, when does PCI operator skills matter most? And I would say that's when the patient's at highest risk. Can PCI mortality risk models can PCI mortality be accurately predicted? How good are our current risk models? I want to go over the data on when providers take on high-risk cases. Are their reputations in terms of their O to E ratios hurt? And then finally, is this even the right question? Should we be focusing more on procedures or on disease states? So when does procedures really matter? Well, this is a case that would be the case where the procedure and skills of the operator do matter a lot. High-risk case, you can see an Impella in place. They've got nasty coronary disease, sort of shrunken down, looking like they're in cardiogenic shock. So this patient, obviously high risk for dying, certainly one for which the skills of the operator, I want the very best that I can have in that situation. Do we have models that can accurately predict PCI risk? And in fact, the ACC NCDR is blessed with a national registry with thousands, if not hundreds, or excuse me, hundreds of thousands of cases for which we can develop pretty darn accurate risk models. If we look at the overall results of those models, cardiogenic shock is a remarkably important predictor. No surprise to this audience. People who generally come into the lab not dead don't die. People who come into the lab half dead do. And so it's not that hard to predict pretty darn accurately who are at high risk for those procedures. You look at the overall curve of the expected mortality, the vast majority of cases, very, very low risk. Difficult to distinguish quality actually in that hump. But on the other side, there's these patients who have very, very high expected mortality. If we look at how well those models discriminate, overall the models do remarkably well. C indices, or the area under the ROC curve, a 0.93 or so in the overall development and even in the validation samples. So very high likelihood that you can actually discriminate those who are likely to die from those who are likely to live for the reasons I just went through. You can look at the various subgroups below where we looked at various groups, and we can find out across most of these spectra we can do pretty darn well. How about calibration? The idea of do what the models predict actually see what we expect to see? Do we actually see it when we look at real-world populations? If we look at it overall, shown in the top panel, most of the patients are low risk, and the models do remarkably accurate, matching up very closely to what one would expect. In the bottom half, we've looked at the sort of upper echelon, the top 20% of risk, and then still the models do pretty darn well. And then if we look at those patients with and without cardiogenic shock and look at them by various parameters of salvage, etc., again, the models do incredibly well at being very accurate at predicting mortality in these highest risk subgroups. If anything, the models tend to slightly over-predict in the high-risk cases so that if you take on these cases, you get a slight bump in your overall expected mortality more than you would actually be potentially observed. So are providers who take on high-risk cases, such as shock, unfairly penalized? You heard this actually in the first discussion, no insult, but these are what the empiric data show. If you look at overall within NCDR data and look at the various groups, there is some differentiation across centers in the risk of the patients that are seen. So in certain cases, the lowest 20% of institutions take on cases that have pretty low mortality and maybe evolve up to threefold higher at the highest acuity centers. Really remember, this is 1 to 3% mortality, not really whoppingly different from that perspective. And although certain individual institutions or providers take on pretty high-risk cases, but if we look at it by even the percentage of shock cases that they take on, it varies between about 2 and 6%. So although we might think every other case is a high-risk shock case, empiric data do not quite defend that there's that much difference among centers. What about if we now divide and look at the centers that take on the highest risk cases in the world by prediction, the top 20%? We look at their O to E ratios, we will find out that lo and behold, they are less than 1, indicating that they actually do better than expected. Now you may come back to me and say, well, of course, The guys who take on the toughest risk cases are the best to begin with, and they could have been harmed, but they're so good that they've overcome it by the fact that they actually still score better than expected. So we try to do another thought experiment. What if we took all the cases presented by a center over the course of 3 years, and we took the highest risk cases from all 3 years and stacked it into one review period, one reporting period? So this is your nightmare year. Every single case you're seeing is the highest risk cases you'll face over an entire 3-year period. We stack it in 1 year, and then we compare how you do in your worst year in terms of expected cases compared to how you do overall. So you're compared to yourself, but only in your toughest cases. And the short answer is, if you can't tell a difference between these lines, there isn't. It's because you do exactly the same on your toughest cases as you do on your average cases, because these models do darn well in actually looking at expected versus observed mortality. This is what the empiric data are. So we concluded from this, the PCI mortality models are actually quite good at predicting risk, that hospitals that treat the highest risk cases, if anything, do better than expected. Even concentrating all your cases into a single year can't make your predictions look much worse. So therefore, we could find no empiric data that would support this. We are not the only ones. Ed Hannon in New York State looking at individual centers in a different way by looking at when they looked at their cases with or without shock. So if you exclude the shock cases in New York State, as requested, would that change how hospitals were ranked? And lo and behold, these are the correlations in individual hospital rankings over a number of different years, including or not including shock, and again, we're sitting around 0.96 to 0.99. These are incredibly correlated. Your performance with or without your shock cases is about the same. And lo and behold, if you even look at low and high outliers, it's remarkably the same in year or out of years. Again, empiric data do not necessarily support the idea that shock cases taken on or not, included or excluded, make a difference. But now we're getting to the emotional part. If you actually do have your name come up in lights, and there's a title that shows your center having worse outcomes, that is a real effect. And I'm not going to deny that that might have an effect on patients' or physicians' behaviors when you're faced with, should I take this person to the lab or should I take them into surgery? If you look at states for which there is public reporting of information, you can actually find that they're less likely than other states to take a person who has an MI or in shock to the lab. And you can find data that actually, if anything, there's a tendency towards higher mortality overall for the treatment of MI patients in those states. These are real empiric data. They're in part driven by emotion perhaps behind it, but they're real empiric data on the impact on a disease state. So in part, when they were reviewing this article that we were talking about before, the editorials in this case took on a very interesting and important point. Well, I wonder if time has come to move away from procedural-based risk scores to one that looks more at the diagnosis of a disease. How do you treat all MI patients, including your patients with shock, relative to looking at whether or not we take a patient into the lab? Put the emphasis on the right part of this equation. And in part, when I concluded on another article that was written on this, this is what I said. When I'm a CCU attending it too. When I am called by my colleagues to take somebody extremely sick to the lab, I don't want them worrying about their risk profiles. Instead, I want them to worry about what's the right thing for my patient. So in conclusion to those 4 questions, can we do it? When does it matter? When the operator skills are most important is the sickest patients. Shock certainly fills that bill. Can PCI, procedural risk, be accurately estimated? Absolutely. When providers take on high-risk cases, are they hurt? Well, probably not by most of these models, but I won't convince you today, and I know that. So in part, we should emphasize the right question. What's the right thing to do for patients who have acute myocardial infarction or cardiogenic shock? Thank you very much.